The Slash from Traxxas is wildly popular right now, and for a lot of good reasons. It looks great, it handles reasonably well, and for an inexpensive racing class, it's really a lot of fun. One of the biggest upgrades you can make is to upgrade from the stock plastic body shocks to the new blue aluminum anodized ones from Dynamite. We're going to show you the basic steps on how to go ahead and do this. One of the first things that you'll notice is that the bodies themselves are, of course, blue anodized. They look great and they have a mirror finish on the chamber, so they should provide very smooth action. The caps are also blue anodized as well to match the shock bodies themselves. We're going to need a couple odds and ends tools to get things started. First of all, to remove the shocks from the truck itself, you're going to need a 3mm and a 2mm Allen wrench. The last thing that you'll need is going to be a set of needle nose pliers, and then you also want some motor spray as well to keep everything clean. You want to perform this task in a clean, well-lit area, just like what we have here. You also want some kind of a shock building stand as well, because that'll help you go ahead and get the air bubbles out of the shocks when you're done. Now, as you can see here, I already have the front shocks off of the truck. So we're going to start with the one that I've already got the spring off of, in just a gentle twist, and it's loosened up. I can remove the rest of the cap just with my fingers. Now, as you can see here, the bladder actually stayed on the top of the shock. At times, it may stick inside the cap itself, so just be observant of that. And then I've got just an old cup that I use for emptying shock fluid out, and if I clean a motor out, things like that. I'm going to dump that out. So now I've just got the bladder here. I'm going to set this aside and pull my other stand forward. The other thing, the RPM parts tray is also really handy too to kind of keep everything organized. And what you want to do too is spray out the inside of the body of the shock with just either some Nitrotech from Low-C. The other thing you can also use here is some Dynamite Magnum Force as well. They both work really well. Don't have a real preference between one and the other. Just spray it out a little bit inside the body. Just because my Nitrotech tends to have the nozzle on, I'm actually going to use that for this purpose. But like I say, they both work about the same. Once you've got some fluid in the shock, shake it up a little bit. That'll help get any extra oil and whatnot trapped underneath the piston free. And now we have to clean the bladder itself. The main thing here is that you don't want to contaminate your new oil that you're putting in the shocks with any old oil that you may have left over either on the piston, on the shock shaft, or in this case, the bladder. You don't have to blast it, just spritz it down, wipe it off, and then we can set that aside until we're ready to rebuild the shocks. Now we're ready for our final shock disassembly here. Before you take everything apart, go ahead and inspect the shock shaft itself. Make sure that there's not any gouges or things like that in the shaft. Now I'm going to use a needle nose pliers here to go ahead and grab the shock shaft. Some people may not like this because they're afraid that it's going to damage the shock shaft. What I do is I'll use the cutting side of a needle nose pliers and I'll actually grab the shock shaft right at the bottom as close to the eyelet as I can get. The thing is, when I grab it down here, it's not going to slip, and second of all, the shock shaft is never going to go that far into the shock body itself, so I don't have to worry about this damaging the O-rings or anything like that inside the shock body. With the shock eyelet off, I can set that aside. I will need to use that later on the new shock. And now we can go ahead and push the shock shaft up through the old body. Now at this point you can also spray down the shock shaft again just to make sure that you've got any extra oil off the shaft. The way that this is assembled is the fact that there is an O-ring on the outside, there is a black plastic spacer in the middle, and then there is a second O-ring closer to the top of the shock body itself. So there's three components here that we're going to pull out. Be very careful as you're pulling out the old O-rings that you don't apply too much pressure. Don't use anything sharp to pull them out. The shock shaft itself a lot of times works very well for pulling those out. You might need to use, like here I'm going to grab the 2mm Allen wrench. That should be able to pop it right out. Main thing, you don't want to tear your seals while you're doing this. And there we have the final seal out of there. And we can take the old shock body now and toss it or keep it as a backup, things like that. Now, if you're going to race, not all tracks are going to go ahead and allow you to run these, so you might want to hold on to the old shock bodies just in case you decide to run at a track that doesn't allow you to upgrade the shocks. Now here we have the new front shock body, and we're going to start by loading the O-rings and the spacer into the bottom of the shock. Now here's perhaps the biggest difference between these shocks and the stock Traxxas shocks. For some reason the fitting on the bottom of the Traxxas shock, there's not enough of a tolerance there. If you try to tighten down the bottom of the shock cap all the way, you're going to bind up your O-rings. It's going to cause a problem. The way these are machined out, the tolerances are a little bit greater, so you can crank down on that bottom cap and it doesn't pinch the O-rings. It's perfect. We're ready at this point too to go ahead and reinstall the shock shaft itself into the shock body, but we're going to make one minor change here too. The way the truck comes out of the box, it comes with 2-hole shock pistons front and rear. Well, I'm going to change my dampening a little bit. I'm actually going to install 3-hole pistons all around. What this does is it affects the pack of the shock. And again, just kind of be observant if there are any scratches or nicks or dings or things like that in the shock shaft itself. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to pull the old shock piston out. What's nice too is Traxxas does include an assortment of pistons with the truck. You don't need to buy anything different, and the stock Traxxas pistons are completely compatible with the Dynamite shocks. It's a direct fit. Once I've got the clip off, just set the E-clip itself aside. And I can pull the old piston off and go on from the 2-hole to the 3-hole. Just slide that right back into place and then load the E-clip onto the E-clip tool, and we'll snap that bad boy back on. Now beyond using a tool such as this, you can also go ahead and just use a flat blade screwdriver like I showed you earlier to remove the E-clip, and then use a pliers just to squeeze it back into place. And that one's back on. For this particular application, I'm actually going to use Losey's 50-weight genuine silicone shock oil. Losey certifies the weights on their oil so that you know they're within just a couple % on every single batch, and the 50-weight works well for this application. I had, I want to say with the 2-hole, I had 40 or 45 weight oil before, and now going to the 50 with 3-hole should provide a little bit different handling. What you'll need to do before you install the shock shaft into the body is go ahead and apply a little bit of shock oil to the shaft and then work it back and forth in the body itself. What this does is it actually lubricates the O-rings to make sure you don't tear them. Now that we have the shock shaft back in the body, we can reinstall the bottom eyelet. Get you a little bit better view here. Grab my pliers. And I'm going to keep an eye here on the shock shaft. I'm going to try to grab it the exact same spot that I did before. What you can also do is grab just the top of the threads till you get most of the way up, and then look for the marks, because you'll indent the shock shaft when you grab it with this, just to make sure that everything's working properly. Now we have the eyelet back on and everything's working real smooth. I just can't believe the fact that I've got this bottom cranked on here, and I mean it's not binding up at all, where anyone who's familiar with the stock shocks will know that if you tighten the bottom cap too much, it binds. At this point I'm going to go ahead and fill up the shock with the 50-weight shock oil, work the shock shaft and piston up and down a little bit. What this does is anytime you put shock oil into the shock, you're going to get a little bit of air trapped underneath the piston. This helps release it. I'm going to set that shock aside. Now we can go ahead and install the bladder in the top of the shock cap. And then just grab the shock cap and start screwing it on. You might notice a little bit of oil leaking out around the sides as you tighten everything down. That's perfectly normal. That's just oil that's being displaced. Once you have everything tightened down, push the shock shaft in, and you should notice a slight rebound effect when you get to the bottom. Wow, these things are really smooth. I can't believe how smooth these are. So there you have it, how to replace and build the Dynamite shock set for the Traxxas Slash. Now, the last couple things you need to do is just go ahead and install your upper and lower spring perches, and of course the spring itself in the middle. If you do have any questions over anything that you've seen here today, please feel free to email us at editors@horizonrc.com. Thanks for watching.